Welcome back to the Midweek Bible Study. We have looked at the prayer of Jesus in John 17, and now we are getting into the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion of Jesus. And as usual with the book of John, we're going to have a different take, a little bit different perspective, and one or two new bits of information, because that's what John does. Plus, he also puts everything within a theological framework. That's his thing. He starts with John chapter 1 with in the beginning was the Word, and there's light and there's darkness, and he carries that theme all the way through the book, which makes it very different from the other Gospels. Speaking of which, next after John, we've had overwhelming requests to continue Just Jesus stories through the book of Luke, and then we'll be done. We will have gone through the entire New Testament in the order in which it was written, except the Gospels. We pulled them aside. And then the Gospels. Our going through the Gospels has taken us much longer than going through the rest of the New Testament in the order in which it was written, because these stories are central to our faith. They are who and what we are about. So are we ready? Let's go. John chapter 18. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had also often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priest and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. We mentioned last week, if you missed it, please go back and listen. Talked a little bit about Judas, and was Judas set up? Was he forced into this? What were his possible motivations? We know some of the answers to this, and we have to rely upon suppositions for others. So go back and check on that. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him. Now, there obviously in Jesus's life, there is a progression of knowledge. When he's 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, he does not know he's the Son of God with unlimited power and the creator of the universe. You don't want a 3-year-old to know that. There are times that he is surprised, that he gets angry, that he'll turn around and why did you say that? Or I'm shocked that this level of faith comes from here. He didn't know everything all the time. In Philippians 2, he laid aside his deity, but in large part to put on humanity and to humble himself. But now that we're getting closer, he knows, and he knows more and more. The Holy Spirit has been opening it up to him, and his Father's been revealing it to him. And so now he knows everything that's coming. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Wow. Now, I truly believe that this is just a simple question that he knew the answer to, and that he was just going to pull away from his friends. Remember, he stepped away from them to be arrested. He did not wait for the mob to come and find him with his friends, and then his friends get arrested as well, which they would have done. Now, that's the way the Romans did things, and this Jewish group most likely would have followed the same pattern. It's the only one they really understood and knew. However, when I see this question, I can't help but think of Judas again. Who is it you want? Who is it you really were looking for? Well, Judas probably, and most of the Jews were looking for a warrior king to overthrow Rome, or perhaps more accurately, just break the yoke of Rome over them and let them have their kingdom and expand the kingdom back to the time of David, before the trouble that began with Solomon and his taxation and his accumulation of wealth and women and the like. Take it back to the glory days of David. Who do you want? There was a movie several years ago called Wonder Woman, and I didn't see the sequel. I don't go to superhero movies, but for some reason I got talked into going to that one. and was impressed at the mythology that it was presenting, because it's a mythology that I'm quite familiar with. No, not Greek mythology or some sort of made up pseudo mythology, which all of that was made up by a psychiatrist in the early 1900s who had some real issues, by the way, if you ever look into the history of that. It is about the mythology of who is it we want to be our God. And Wonder Woman in that movie turns out to be the God that we really needed and we really wanted, because she's looking at World War I and all the casualties and the pain and the slaughter, and she's turning around to people and saying, why are you letting this happen? Why is this acceptable to you? And so she goes in and single-handedly wins the thing. And that's the kind of God we want. We want a kind of God who will ride to our rescue. Please underline, circle, and draw arrows toward the word our rescue when we want him to. We want him to leave us alone other times. If we're just going out to have, air quotes, good times, and we'd rather not be examined by the God of the universe, then leave us alone for that one. But, or if we want to watch our shows, and we know some of the shows carry offensive things, but leave us alone for those things. But if our neighbor comes against us, or let's not do petty. Let's not do petty. If a nation develops a weapon and threatens us, we want a God who goes in and doesn't slaughter the nation, but finds the leaders, the people in charge of this, deactivates the weapon, and either sorts them out with a stern talking to or obliterates them. That's who we want. Some people want a Jesus that is nothing but a sock puppet, that will just say and do whatever they want him to say and do. And you hear a lot of that. And you hear politicians quote a Jesus that I'm not familiar with. They will either try to make him super angry, mean, and on their side, or super liberal, super progressive, and on their side. The thing about Jesus is that if you have political views of any kind, Jesus will offend you at one, if not several points in his ministry. So who is it you want? One of the marks of emotional intelligence from back in my days as a psychotherapist and working in research psychology, one of the marks of emotional intelligence is the ability to accept what is. You don't have to like it. In fact, you can hate it. You can be appalled by it, but you understand this is what this is. Are you able to accept what is? One of those things you have to accept is, are you willing to accept the God who is? Not the God of your desires, not the God of your dreams, not the God of your wishes, not the God of you, but with the God costume on. The God who is. Jesus walking down, and this question, it gets me just like God's question to Moses on the mountain, what is in your hand? We now realize how profound that was. But to Moses, the answer was a stick. Or the question of God to Adam and Eve in the garden when he goes, where are you? He was not speaking about a GPS location there. They were now metaphysically in a new place. Where are you? Where have you placed yourself? These questions to me are fantastic. And I think going through and looking at the questions in the Bible may be one of the more impactful, if I can use a word I don't like, studies that one can do. Jesus goes down to the mob. If Jesus had come as one of the Maccabees reincarnated to overthrow Rome's dominion over Jerusalem, Judea, and reestablish the kingdom of David, the mob might have still come, to be honest. Why? Well, because it would still cause trouble with Rome and might cause issues, but they might have come to support him. But that's not who Jesus was. Jesus disappoints people. God disappoints people because he's not the God they want. He's the God who is. Now, we mentioned this, and I can go on this for hours, trust me, but I'm not, because we're in a story. We're doing some theology, but we're not doing deep theology. So we're in the story. Jesus walks away from his friends, protecting his friends. Amazing. Kudos for that. We know his friends kept falling asleep during this time. John doesn't bring that up, but we get it in other Gospels. He draws the mob away from them. And he goes, who are you looking for? Who do you want? And they replied, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, that's me. Jesus didn't hide, didn't say, don't know the guy. He said, that's me. Judas the traitor was standing there with them. Now, if you're reading an NIV, that is in parentheses. And what that means is it almost certainly was a textual note somebody wrote in a margin that got put into the text. We have just wrapped up a very long series on where we got our Bible. And so that might help you. If you listen to that, you'll understand this. It's what we call a gloss, something which is brought in. Doesn't change the flow, but it is something which wasn't in the oldest manuscripts. Seems to have been added in as an explanation or as a bit of information. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, why did they do that? Because he was shiny? He was shiny and there are little angels flying around and, heavens parted and some horns stuck through and, like an old Monty Python sketch. No. Because he wasn't who they were expecting. I mean, that's the whole problem, isn't it? They were expecting this big warrior thing, but Jesus wasn't going to be that. And so they were expecting the guy holding the lamb, the sweet guy with the long blonde hair and then the shiny robe. But what they get is this son of a stone carver. That's what Joseph probably was, we now know, but we'll probably never get over our older understanding of the word and calling him a carpenter. Regardless, he'd had scars, he had calluses. He'd been sleeping out rough with these men for 3.5 years. He would not have looked like the pictures. And as we've already talked about, Jesus was not tiny. He was not weak. Cleared out the temple. John has him clearing it out twice. Whether John's just telling the story twice for emphasis or for points, or whether he really did do it twice, we'll let other people argue about. But it's a fact that when Jesus cleared out the temple guards didn't dare to didn't touch him. And later, whenever Jesus is teaching and the chief priests and scribes are angry and want the guards to do stuff, guards won't touch him. And there's no indication that they're not going to touch him because he's so holy and he's shiny. It's more than our job's worth, man. We're not going after that guy. It's rather like, and no disrespect for these people at all, period. But rather like a mall cop or an entry-level correctional officer in a prison or jail. They're not paid enough to go after the big guy in there who is powerful and alike. They're going to wait until the group gets here. They're going to wait because it truly is not worth what they're being paid to engage that person. And again, no disrespect to those jobs at all. I'm glad those people are there. But there's a limit. I mean, if you want a Green Beret, you're going to have to pay Green Beret prices. And malls and prisons don't do that. So these people fall down. It's like, whoa, dude, he's big. We thought he was a pastor, a preacher. And we all know those guys are weaklings. So, we're going after him with our lanterns and our torches. And we get this big guy and he goes, who are you looking for? And he goes, Jesus of Nazareth. And he goes, that's me. And it's like, oh. And they fall down. They draw back and fall to the ground. So again, we know in the other Gospels, he kind of has to step forward to them again and say, who is it you want? Now that question again Man, it hits me. It actually makes me a little dizzy sometimes, the weight of that question. And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. I imagine at that point their voice had changed a little bit. They're like, Jesus, Nazareth. He said, I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, let these men go. The apostles had woken up. They had cautiously joined the edges of the party. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. That was back in the prayer in chapter 17, verse 12. Then Simon Peter, had to be Simon, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? We have to put the Peter story in with all the other Gospels. And Luke will actually give us a little bit more information about swords on that night. And while a lot of people try to explain it away, I don't really think they need to. The apostles, some of them were armed. At least they had 2 swords among them in the book of Luke. And he'd even told them to have those available. I know, because I have dear friends that are so committed pacifists that they become outraged when I talk about any of this. But there is no indication that Jesus was a pacifist when it came to personal protection. Now, was Jesus anti-war? I think you could absolutely make that argument. And I'm pro self-defense. I'm pro protecting the innocent among us, but I'm anti-war. I would be far more likely to support war if the people who declared it had to go on the front lines and fight it with the grunts. But instead, they are 60, 70, and 80-year-old men and women coddled with special treats and consideration that we citizens don't get, who accrue millions of dollars while sending others out to fight and die. So no, I don't support that at all. And so I'm a complicated individual. Are you complicated too? I bet you are. I hope you are. Because if everything to you in the world is yellow or everything in the world to you is red, then you're not really opening your eyes to seeing the complexities of things. But moving on. Simon Peter had told Jesus, I won't let them kill you. And Jesus had sternly reprimanded him before. Do you remember when he said, get thee behind me, Satan, to use the King James words? He says, Satan's already asked for you several times. And I've said, no, that's a terrifying bit of information to hear about yourself. But Peter wants to protect Jesus. And it's not just protecting Jesus, it's protecting the whole movement. The Messiah has come. We've been waiting many hundreds of years. We've got to protect this movement. And so he swings. It's a swing and a miss. We don't really know this. We don't know what headgear Malchus was wearing. But if you don't know this, the round helmets that were all the vogue during the medieval age and a lot of the Bronze Age in this time, and Iron Age, generally didn't protect the ears. Why? Because you need to hear. You need to hear on the battlefield. You need to hear the noises, the trumpets, which give directions according to how they sound. All of that you need to hear. The problem is, sword to hit up here and slide off and cut off the ear. We still have an ear canal, but the outer ear is messed up. We know that from the other Gospels that Jesus reaches down, picks up the ear, puts it back on, which is great. A sign of compassion. Once again, you got to like Jesus the more you know Jesus. But John's whole point is light and darkness. And Jesus has to go into the darkness to fight it on behalf of the light. So he tells Peter, I told you, I have to do what my Father's laid out for me to do. Boom. You know why? Because Jesus also had to accept the God who is. And yes, he's part of that. But this is the reality, Peter. This isn't a movie. You don't get to jump in and save it with a sword. This is something bigger, which is going to save a lot more folk than your sword can save. Let's move on. Then the detachment of soldiers, with its commander and the Jewish officials, arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews, it'd be good if one man died for the people. So we're not dealing with people who deal in moral absolutes here. They are very, very much moral relativist. Like, people die, so it'd be better if he dies than everybody dies. Now, as I've said to you before, we do make that kind of calculations whenever we send in firefighters into a burning building, or we put uniforms on police officers or deputies. We're really saying it's better that one person takes the risk than all of us. But that's a community decision. Caiaphas was saying, we got a good, sweet system going here. We don't want to mess it up. It's all right, let this innocent man die. So it's a totally different thing. But interestingly, isn't it that they didn't take Jesus to Caiaphas? Caiaphas, the high priest. Aren't you supposed to go to the high priest? Well, of course you are. But this is one of the many illegalities in the trial and the handling of all of this. You weren't supposed to have a trial at night. You weren't supposed to have a trial without witnesses for the defense. It's a complicated thing we could talk about later. Leviticus talks about it, so does Deuteronomy, the rules for trials. And it was really designed to make sure that the accused had a fair go of things. In fact, in most cases, if the verdict against him by all of the judges and jury and the assembled panel was unanimous, there were times you let the guy free because it was obvious there was nobody to speak for him. There had been nobody to sway anybody for him. As I said, it's complicated, but this is one of the illegalities. They brought him to Annas. Why? Because the father-in-law was a real power, even though he wasn't the high priest that year. High priest that year? Did they switch every year? Well, not in the Old Testament, no. But whenever the Greeks came in, and then later the Romans, they instituted a form of control over the priesthood in the temple, and they switched out people regularly. There was even a switching of power between Pharisees and Sadducees. So uncertain trumpets, as the Bible might say, the people didn't know which way to go, and money was absolutely involved in who got to be high priest. But even though Caiaphas is now high priest, his father-in-law is the one in charge, calling the shots. You ever been in those situations where a husband and wife can't really do what they want to do because father-in-law or mother-in-law or father and mother, it's not just the in-laws, are really calling the shots? I truly believe that's in opposition to the will of God. And I will fight for the individual couple's right to make their decisions, even if it's a bad decision, over the handing over of their authority to moms and dads. But it's even worse when you see it in churches. I've seen retired elders who are still the pope of the church in that area. They would sit back, now I'm not, I'm just retired now, but I sure wouldn't put up with that. And so all the groups, okay. This is one of the dirty realities of some communities. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Now, who's another disciple? The other disciple. We don't know. It doesn't say other apostle. We know that John gets in here. But who's the other disciple? It is, it's argued rather credibly that it was Luke. Others believe it was Lazarus, but we don't know for certain. So just to let you know, the discussion continues. Because the disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the girl on duty there and brought Peter in. So Luke might have been able to pull that off. Lazarus might have been able to pull that off. Could have been Simon of Arimathea. We know he had rank and was able to move among the Romans without too much danger. It's just really interesting, this unnamed helper. As this guy goes back to, we're going to let this man in too, Peter. The girl at the gate. You are not one of the disciples, are you? The girl at the door asked Peter. He said, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they'd made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. That didn't look good, does it? Kind of reminds you of Psalm chapter 1. Blessed is he that standeth, and doesn't stand and sit, and all this. He doesn't walk, stand, and sit. There's a progression of hanging around the scoffers, the unbelievers, the wayward. Most likely he was just there to stay warm and also look like he was one of the guys. But that's kind of a problem too. Again, I do, in Peter's defense, I got to ask the question, what did you want him to do? He already found that Jesus won't let him rescue him. So what do you want Peter to do? And some would say, well, I would just wish that he wouldn't deny Jesus. Hey, we can all wish that. But can I ask you a really hard question? What would it have gained Christ or Peter if Peter had said, yeah, I'm not just a disciple, I'm an apostle. I'm one of his 12 and I'm one of his 3 best friends. How would that have helped Jesus, who didn't want help? Interesting questions. And besides, let's leave Peter alone. We have planks in our own eyes. We don't need to go digging for specks in others. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest. Did you catch it? The father-in-law wasn't the high priest anymore, but that's the way he ruled. That's the way he acted. And so when the man struck him, he said, is that the way you answered the high priest? Yeah, this is ugly. And sadly, far too familiar. Far too familiar in our societies. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, You're not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. This is unhandy. Challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Well, he has denied Christ. Now, in John, I find it fascinating that Peter's denials are that he's following Christ or that he's a disciple of Christ. In the other Gospels, he'll say, I don't know the man. So he actually denies knowledge of Christ. So the stories aren't all the same. That doesn't bother me, not even a little bit, because they were bringing out different points and we all have our different perspectives. And I think there's a love and a gentleness and a kindness in John that he softens these things when he talks about other folk. It's just, if you read the Gospels again and again and again, you see this, that where Mark might be a little rough on things and Luke a little clinical and fill in some gaps with interviews, and Matthew just being very rather journalistic about things. John softens the people and doesn't make them look as silly or as offbeat as the others do. Well, we've hit our 30 minutes and we need to stop here. Things will move on fairly quickly from here. I hope you're enjoying these studies. They've been going on for a long time. And I'm aware that we used to have, 400-600 on a Monday, and now we're half of where we were, because I think sometimes people do get tired of just hearing just Jesus stories, but others of you, at least 200 to 400 a week, are hungry for them. And that makes me happy, because Jesus stories are why I'm a Christian and why I've stayed a Christian through all of these years. I hope they're helping you. Thank you for helping us through your prayers, your encouraging notes. Those are huge to us. And of course, your support that feeds us and keeps us going. God bless you, and we'll talk to you next week.